Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Rebecca Carmeli Peslak, and I am the digital media producer for Seed World Group. Today, we are talking about how weather impacts what you see on the grocery store shelves. Weather has a huge impact on every part of farming and growing, from what time the seed can go into the ground, how long it takes to grow, all the way to what consumers see on the shelves. The La Nina weather pattern has been impacting growers for the last 3 to 4 years. As we transition into a new weather pattern, we're going to learn how it will impact growers. All weather has economic impacts, both good and bad. Today, I'm excited to be joined by 3 experts to discuss how weather impacts the consumer at the grocery store. Neil Townsend, Chief Marketing Analyst at FarmLink, Ashley Grantham, PhD Scientist and Business Executive at GrowWell, and Sean Hackett, President of Hackett Financial Advisors. Neil, Allison, and Sean, thank you so much for joining me today and bringing your expertise to Seed Speaks. Neil, could you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, my name's Neil Townsend. I work in Winnipeg, Manitoba for an organization called Grain Fox, and we deliver marketing advice to farmers across Western Canada and Southern Ontario in Canada. And we're mainly, responsible for telling them when to market their grains and oil seeds and pulses. And all of our farmers could definitely tell you that weather is the main focus of their attention, particularly at this time of year as they're getting the crop in and they're, waiting to see what the weather will be during the growing season.
Thanks, Neil. Allison, could you please also introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm Allison, and I sort of work at the intersection of science and business. I've been working in the agri-food sector for much of the last 2 decades. I've worked on the research side of things at Penn State and the Rodale Institute, as well as on the food business side, leading supply chain and food procurement at a large e-commerce company. And for the last 4 years, I've been running GrowWell, a consulting firm that serves companies and NGOs working on various aspects of the food system. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison. Sean, could you also introduce yourself?
Sure, Allison. Sure, Rebecca. Sorry about that. We are specialized in long-term weather forecasting. We've developed what we call a climate cycle algorithm that utilizes long-term cycles of the sun, oceans, correlating thousands of years into the past, and we project them into the future so that we can provide our farmers with appropriate weather forecasting, and so they can utilize that to help manage the risks on the farm, time their cash sales, or use futures and options to hedge their risks on the farm. And that's really our specialty, is developing those long-term weather cycle plans for them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being here today. So to start off our Q&A, we were in a La Nina weather pattern this past year. As we are midway through 2023, are we seeing a shift in that weather pattern?
I'll start off. The answer is we are seeing a shift. We had a multi-year La Nina that is now clearly transitioning to an El Nino. It's not quite there yet. If you look at the central sea surface temperatures of the Pacific, called ENSO 3.4, we're at this plus 0.3, plus 0.4 degrees C. You need to get to plus 0.5 to technically designate that El Nino sea surface temperatures have arrived in that area. But we're clearly moving there, Rebecca, and it is expected that we will designate an El Nino probably by June or July, and that it should peak sometime late this year. And so this really dramatically changes the weather extremes we have seen, and it offers new weather extremes going forward in different regions for different crops.
Awesome. Neil or Allison, anything to add there?
Yeah, just following up on Sean, a lot of people in the agricultural industry are talking about this shift to El Nino. My only point is there's other weather circumstances that have an impact on the growing regions of North America, particularly the Northern Plains or the Central Corn Belt and Canada. And in Canada, for example, right now, We have these fires burning. Those are unrelated to El Nino or La Nina. They're related to just like excessive temperatures and some dry weather, and they're pretty far in our northern growing region. So people have seen the smoke around Western Canada. So that will have an impact.
Definitely.
Yeah, I don't have terribly much to add to that, but I think just thinking about the timing, yes, we're expecting to enter this El Nino by late this summer, probably, but we won't really see the full effects. Probably the more extreme heat will come next year in 2024, but we're also going into this in the landscape of already, climate change pushing us toward more extremes broadly. And so, the potential for record-breaking temperatures is quite probable for especially 2024, and could be challenging, which plays, of course, into the fires, not just here, but northern South America is, one of those regions that's expected to be drier under El Nino conditions. And they've already had a lot of challenges with fires in the Amazon, and dry conditions can further exacerbate those issues too.
Hey, Rebecca, I think Allison is on to something in terms of when you transition from La Nina to El Nino, you don't immediately get the atmospheric to sign on to the El Nino effect. There's a lag effect. It takes time for everything to kind of link up. And so I would completely agree that it's, more like the fall or later in the year that you're truly going to get your global El Nino weather pattern that then carries over into the North American growing cycle. So that's a very important point to make, that people think just because that ENSO 3.4 has reached those sea surface temperature thresholds, it doesn't mean you immediately get El Nino weather.
Definitely. I think that's a great transition into how impactful is weather on growing. And from there, what can we do to work around or potentially mitigate the negative impact that weather has?
Well, maybe I'll start with that one. Just it's very critically important. I mean, especially the majority of farmers in North America and around the world are dryland farmers. I mean, meaning that they rely on rain patterns and rainfall to kind of give the precipitation moisture needed to grow a crop. And then the other thing I'd say is that there's two different aspects. There's quality and there's quantity. So, we think of quantity as being like, the overall growing conditions, but quality is also dictated quite a bit by the weather patterns. So, for example, a lot of Western Canadian farmers, they grow pulses like lentils and peas. The market is very sensitive to sort of the color of those, and rainfall or poorly timed rain at harvest can detriment the color and detriment the quality, and that consumers don't like it at the grocery store, but also farmers lose money because of degradations in quality, which are often related to the thing. The one thing that I'd say that there's been a lot of work on over the last 20, 30 years is sort of producing seeds that are very drought tolerant, and basically they can keep some potential longer than maybe they could in the past. And then when the rain comes, that potential can be unleashed. Of course, there's a limit to that, but I mean, I think that there's a greater variance in when the rainfall comes now, and you can still maintain some yield.
Awesome. Sean or Allison, anything to add to that?
I would look at it from a perspective of what governments could do. So let's just take India, for example, a country that historically is disproportionately impacted by hot, dry weather during El Nino. And, if I am the Indian government and I am looking at these weather patterns, I might decide to hold back some rice exports or some sugar exports or I might try to create a bigger reserve in years where I know that historically we have come up with short crops so that we have enough, or they have enough for their country, and they don't get into a serious shortage or a humanitarian issue. So I think governments can be proactive in managing their inventory based upon historical cycles of what happens to their countries during certain weather patterns.
Allison?
Yeah, I was thinking of this a little bit more from the lens of specialty crops, which most of our food crops are C3 crops, but especially, fruiting specialty crops. We, when I was at the e-commerce company, used, degree day models to work with our contracted growers to model crop maturity and understand when the fairy tale eggplants that we contracted were actually going to be ready for harvest. And one of the things that I think about a lot when we're talking about extreme temperature is, plants start growing at a certain temperature, the growth rate increases to whatever their maximum is, and then it starts tapering off. We think about that a lot, but we also, pollination is a function of temperature, and as we're facing more of these extreme heat events over during the El Nino period, we're going to see more challenges with pollination, and that can impact, as we were saying, not just the quantity of crop that's produced, but also the quality of those crops. And so thinking about how to time planting to avoid some of those high risk times, or manage for the increased likelihood of extreme heat is going to be a real challenge of the weather that we're expecting in the coming years.
Definitely. So the big question, how does weather impact what we see at the grocery stores? Anyone can feel free to take that one.
Well, I'm not as familiar with the areas that Allison is talking about like fruits and vegetables or herbs and things like that. Obviously, I'm more in what we call commodities, like not ingredients, like big, wheat, corn, soybeans, canola, this kind of thing. And I mean, I think usually, product gets to the grocery store, even in sort of a shorter cycle crop where, we don't grow as much. But, what really happens is that the price will reflect that. And we've seen, several instances of that in the last 10, 15 years where, like we've had a smaller production of canola, for example, and canola oil prices go up quite a bit for the consumer. And, most of the crops that I'm talking about, like the shortages aren't maybe felt as much in North America. We just adjust prices, but in other countries where they're priced out of, commodities that get too expensive, then they have to find substitutes, and there is a lack of availability for them as well.
Yeah. I think, that's the price thing is probably the biggest way we see it. But I think even here, I'm in New Jersey, we have all gotten used to seeing a lot more out of stocks on grocery store shelves in the US over the last few years. I think, some of those disruptions were attributed to the pandemic, but there's also been the recalls in the case of baby formula. Recently, there have been a couple of big ransomware attacks on major warehousers that caused large disruptions in availability of a lot of fresh and frozen product. Trade disputes like the avocado availability issue last year, and then weather disruptions on top of it. But I think, people think about those weather disruptions, you're thinking about your sort of immediate surrounding area. But over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of change in the geography of production, particularly for the things I'm thinking about more, your specialty crops, your vegetables, your fruits, as the US has become a net importer of those things, and a lot of production has transitioned from California and Arizona to Mexico and other places in Latin America. We have become accustomed to, seeing blueberries on our grocery store shelves in February. But the weather that's impacting whether those blueberries are there or not is not the weather in New Jersey or the weather even in Florida. It's the weather in Chile or the weather in Peru. So thinking about the weather, not just in those production regions that have diversified, but also the weather, at the ports of entry. Is there, some massive heat wave at the Laredo port of entry, and all of those trucks, those reefers are running out of fuel, and then the reefers are going off, and then you're going to have a disruption of all of those imports. There's a lot of ways in which weather can impact what ultimately winds up on the store shelf. And I think increasingly we're seeing it, not just be, big price spikes in broccoli in April and November when it's the transition season, but, literal signs in the produce section that say, sorry, there was a freeze or there was a flood. And so this is, out of stock, even in the US.
Sean, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just add that, there's also a psychological component to it. So like down here in South Florida, we occasionally from time to time get a hurricane threat, and the fear that there could be shortages of food because of weather. You get people that come out and start to, buy more or panic buy or take action that's abnormal. And then you have immediate shortages, not because necessarily that there is one, because there's a worry or a perception that there could be one. So I think human psychology also has a lot to do with how these shortages or fears of shortages can kind of develop and kind of take a personality of their own.
Definitely. So we've talked a lot about the current weather and the future weather. When we're talking about grocery stores and getting the products to the consumer, is it the current weather, or how far in the past is the weather that's directly impacting the consumer?
I mean, I could start on that one. I think people, there's often not enough of an appreciation of, how long it takes to bring a crop to market. And so, if you have flooding or extreme rainfall that delays planting, you might not see those effects right away. It could be, the flooding or extreme rainfall that happened 3-4 months ago that is, causing the disruption or the price spike that you're seeing now. And then I think there's also some longer term weather trends. I'm thinking about like aridification of the American West, which has challenged wheat production year over year. And so there's not an acute stock shortage on store shelves, but consumers are, and not to say that weather is the only thing at play. There's the war in Ukraine, there's past year's high fertilizer prices, but we're seeing this sort of compounding impact that is, ripples through the supply chain, is reflected in the price of flour, reflected in the price of processed goods that contain wheat. And those are going to continue for, a year plus. We're seeing those continue to ripple through. So it's not, there was a snowstorm yesterday and you see it next week. There's oftentimes these sort of long lag times that do continue to ripple out from extreme weather events.
Yeah, like a lot of the commodities that I deal with, like pulses, oil seeds, and the grains, they have what the concept of a marketing year, and there's ending stocks related to those marketing years. And, these are global commodities. And again, when weather has an impact, like the 2012 drought in the United States, or, the 2021 drought in Canada on key crops, I mean, it's a multi-year thing. Like it takes a while to repair the supply and demand balances and put things back into balance. And then, I mean, this is somewhat related to experience, I suppose, but, Sean mentioned India as a country very sensitive to the weather, and another country that's had, very big droughts in the past that have caused quite a bit of calamity. So they're sensitive to that, is China. And China is very protective of their stockpiles, but they tend to sort of try to accumulate enough to give them like a buffer for any one season or something like that, so that, they have enough. But I mean, like this past year, they've been replenishing some of their wheat stocks, for example. And, that can have an impact if you're tight already, that kind of sustains a higher price.
Definitely. Sean, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, and I think it also comes down to what I call reflexivity, meaning if you start off with a large ending stocks, you can have some bad weather and the price is not going to really react right away. It's when those supplies get to a tipping point. And then what you go from a modest rise to a parabolic move, all of a sudden it's this reflexivity move that when you get a weather problem, at a time of tight stocks already. So I think when those prices show up at the consumer's level, it has a lot to do with where we are in the overall buffer stock supply. That, does China have a lot of wheat, or are they currently short of wheat? And that has a lot to do with how quickly you do see those prices reflect on the consumer level.
Interesting. So, of course, there's a lot of different factors that go into getting from the seed all the way to whatever the consumer is purchasing from the shelf. But just from sort of, some type of a start to some type of a finish, what do or how do consumers or producers and growers, and then also the grocery stores, how can they limit the impact on the consumer?
Could get started and then I'll pass the torch. So I think, depending on whether you're thinking about the grains and the oil seeds or specialty crops, there's different strategies. And we do see growers in the United States installing a lot more tile drainage, expanding that, which can help them deal with getting that water off the field when we're having more of these extreme rainfall events. A challenge of that is then it's not there when they might need it later. And so we are also seeing more irrigation installed, although there's other regions in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska where the aquifers we've been drawing on are, California, not really able to, provide further mitigation because we've been using them for the last 100 years to mitigate the weather challenges that those regions have long had. But then there's also, a whole bunch of other strategies that specialty crop growers have also long used. I'm thinking about, orchards and orange groves where growers can, if they're expecting a late frost or a late freeze, they can spray down, with overhead irrigation to give their developing crops a couple extra degrees. They used to, now fans are more common, but actual outdoor heaters like diesel fired smudge pots. My grandpa actually used to work in the 40s in the orange groves in California, and they would light all of these, smudge pots to literally heat the orange groves to protect the fruit. Use of reflective plastic mulch to keep the soil cool is an increasingly common tactic in vegetable production. So there's a ton of things that growers are doing, not to mention, variety selection and all of the things that we've touched on a bit already to help make sure that there is supply. And so I think, we are seeing growers do all of those things. I think right now in this environment, what grocery stores, some of what's happening consumer side has, I'm not sure that the goal has been to limit the impact on consumers recently.
Interesting. Neil or Sean?
Yeah, I
anything
just
to
think I think Allison did a good job of talking about what the farmer can do. I mean, again, like a lot of the farmers I deal with, they feel frustrated because they are sort of commodification. They deal with a commodity. So any one thing that they can do seems, and they make a lot of efforts. They're tiling for corn and soybeans and stuff like that, and make efforts. But at the grocery store level, I think that, the way people have consumed has changed over the last 15, 20 years. And people are buying less ingredients and more sort of ready-made meals. The ready-made meal, which includes a lot of the vegetables, or, we mentioned avocados, and, people buy guacamole, which is already prepared. I think it's harder to stem the price increase, and it's harder to see those prices get reversed based on the underlying commodity or ingredient in them, just because we have, the labor costs, the transportation costs, all of the other costs that are associated with that. And it's the old adage that, my farmers have always said, they get X amount for the flour that goes into the bread, but the bread now is like $6 or $7, and their price really hasn't changed. And it's because people are eating an artisan bread now instead of eating a standard sandwich loaf.
Definitely. Sean, did you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, there's always value in the marketplace. So just take the current example where we have extremely cheap pork prices relative to extremely expensive beef prices. There's an opportunity for the consumer to say, I'm going to switch my meat protein habits and consume a much greater quantity of meat, pork meat protein to kind of save money, because not everything is in the same cycle. When we had the avian bird flu that was affecting the egg laying chickens, and we had this crazy spike in the egg price, you can shift your consumption patterns away from overvaluation and look for replacements of undervaluation to kind of keep your budget in line. And to me, I think that's the most practical way, and of course, we know that supermarkets have sales and they have coupons and there's things that they do to move product, and you should always be looking for ways to take advantage of those things at times when prices, may be starting to stretch your budget beyond your comfort level.
Definitely. We did have a question come in from our audience. This one is from Alex Martin. What is the best way to describe to consumers why some produce won't appear in grocery stores, especially if they don't understand agriculture well? Sean, I think you kind of touched on this with how some things are a little bit more on the psychological side with like panic buying.
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. You do have that psychological thing where if the media is telling you that there's an egg shortage, then everybody, instead of buying, a dozen eggs, they go buy, 3 dozen eggs. That's one way that you lose product on the shelf. Another way is you just simply have insufficient supplies to meet the ongoing demand. So, a lot of the vegetables, because of the very, very harsh weather out in California and out west during the extreme drought that they had the last couple of years, there was a lot of vegetable products that out of season that were just simply absolutely positively just not available for that time because we just didn't produce enough in those key vegetable regions to supply that. So I think it's a combination of psychological, and it's a combination of just, at times if the supply is low enough and you get in the wrong seasonal time where you're not harvesting new supplies, you simply don't have enough to go around.
Neil or Allison, did you want to add anything to that audience question?
Yeah, I guess I just also wanted to add, I'm always thinking about the distribution segment, having worked in e-commerce, and there are times, we have had here in New Jersey, some of those, the bowl cyclones, whatever, those winter storms that are, just take things out. And you have to think there are a lot of hands that touch the food that you ultimately see in the grocery store. And those hands have families and houses and have to get to work. And so if a region is shut down, you can't drive on the roads because they haven't been plowed, your kids' school is closed, the workers who need to get to the distribution center to move that product are not going to be able to do it. And so there might be some disruptions related to that. And that's, it's just like the same reason your kids might have a snow day because the bus driver couldn't get to pick them up. That is a factor that impacts the whole world. Not, the food system is not exempt. The food system works very hard to handle, but it does that can come as a shortage. It's going to go away. Do you really need it that day, or could you wait a few days? Those are things that resolve within a week or so.
Becca, I'll give a great example of something that happened here in Florida. In Fort Lauderdale, just a little while ago, we had a historic flood. I think there was something like 36 inches of rain fell in 12 hours. And it literally flooded the port of Fort Lauderdale out, and you could not unload ships that had fuel on them for several days. And we were running shortages at the gas pump. There's literally no gas available, not because the supplies weren't there, but they were sitting out in ships out at sea, not being able to be unloaded. And so we had a short-term shortage because of this extreme flooding event. I think, to Allison's point, that's a great example of how disruptions in the logistical process of how you go from A to B can impact supplies in local regions.
Yeah, and just I think another thing we're struggling here in Canada, and I mean it's a political issue in the United States. Like, a lot of the crops that make it to the grocery stores are, picked or harvested by, recent immigrants or people on special visas to do the picking. And if the political climate makes it more unfriendly to have these people there, or the opportunity isn't what it once was. I mean, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to just put up a sign that says I need my strawberries picked or I need my vegetables picked at a certain time, and have people who are just like permanently living or have lived in North America for a long time to go and pick those. So there are a lot of cases too where the farmer is frustrated because of the political climate. They don't have the labor supply that they want, and I think that's something that looks like it's going to be increasing over time. So as Allison mentioned, there's a huge human element to getting the groceries onto the grocery shelf.
Well, thank you all so much for your feedback to that question and overall for being here, Neil, Allison, and Sean. I really enjoyed learning from all of you, and I was happy to share this information and all of your expertise with our audience. Since that's all the time we have, next week on Seed Speaks, join Alex Martin and experts to discuss how plant breeders are utilizing chefs to pick varieties to breed. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great week.